Beyond the spectacle of space battles and planetary assaults, a more insidious threat undermined the Empire's might. The sheer scale of the Imperial war machine created logistical challenges that would make any supply chain expert's head spin. How many resources does it take to keep 25,000 Star Destroyers operational? The numbers reveal a staggering vulnerability that the rebels were uniquely positioned to exploit. Logistics has long been the unsung hero of military operations, often determining the outcome of conflicts more decisively than flashy tactics or advanced weaponry. The Galactic Empire, with its vast territorial holdings and massive fleet, faced an unprecedented challenge in maintaining its sprawling supply network. The data paints a picture of a logistical system stretched to its limits, with critical weaknesses that would prove fatal in the face of a determined and agile opponent. At the heart of the Empire's logistical nightmare were its 25,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers. These massive vessels, each requiring a crew of thousands and consuming enormous quantities of fuel and supplies, form the backbone of Imperial power projection. However, they also represented a significant drain on resources and a complex logistical puzzle. The sheer number of Star Destroyers necessitated an intricate web of supply lines, refueling stations, and maintenance facilities spread across the galaxy. The Empire's centralized and rigid supply structure, while theoretically efficient, proved to be a critical vulnerability. This top-down approach to logistics left little room for flexibility or local adaptation. When faced with the hit-and-run tactics of the Rebel Alliance, the Empire's supply lines became easy targets. Small, mobile rebel forces could disrupt entire sectors of Imperial logistics with precision strikes on key supply nodes or hyperspace lanes. Another factor contributing to the Empire's logistical fragility was its heavy reliance on a limited number of key industrial centers. Corporations like drive yards played a crucial role in the production and maintenance of the Imperial fleet. While this centralization allowed for standardization and economies of scale, it also created potential single points of failure. A successful attack on a major shipyard or production facility could have far-reaching consequences for the Empire's ability to maintain its military presence across the galaxy. The massive scale of Imperial logistics also made rapid adaptation to changing battlefield conditions extremely difficult. In a galaxy where light-speed travel was commonplace, the ability to quickly redeploy forces and supplies could mean the difference between victory and defeat. However, the Empire's bureaucratic structure and the sheer inertia of its enormous supply chain often resulted in slow response times to emerging threats or opportunities. This lack of agility was further compounded by inter-service rivalry and bureaucratic inefficiencies within the Imperial military. Different branches of the armed forces often worked at cross purposes, competing for resources and prioritizing their own objectives over the overall strategic goals of the Empire. This lack of coordination led to wasteful duplication of efforts, misallocation of resources, and gaps in supply coverage that could be exploited by enemy forces. Fuel distribution posed another significant challenge for Imperial logistics. The vast distances between star systems and the energy requirements of Imperial technology meant that an uninterrupted flow of fuel was critical to maintaining military operations. Any disruption to this fuel supply network could potentially ground entire fleets or leave planetary garrisons isolated and vulnerable. Food production and distribution systems were equally crucial and equally vulnerable. Feeding the crews of thousands of starships and the garrisons of countless occupied worlds required an enormous and complex network of agricultural planets, processing facilities, and transport ships. Rebel attacks on food convoys or agricultural centers could create widespread shortages, potentially leading to unrest in occupied systems and lowering the morale and combat effectiveness of Imperial forces. The time and resources needed to resupply Imperial fleets presented another logistical hurdle. Even with advanced technology, the process of refueling and restocking a Star Destroyer was time-consuming and resource-intensive. This created windows of vulnerability that could be exploited by rebel forces, who could strike when Imperial ships were in port or otherwise indisposed. Data analysis reveals that the Empire's ability to rapidly redeploy forces was significantly hampered by these logistical constraints. While individual ships could move quickly through hyperspace, coordinating the movement of large fleets along with their necessary supply chains was a complex and time-consuming process. This lack of strategic mobility allowed the more agile rebel forces to often dictate the terms of engagement, choosing when and where to strike based on Imperial vulnerabilities. As formidable as the Empire's ships and weapons appeared, their true vulnerability lay hidden in lines of code and network protocols. Our data analysis reveals a startling truth about Imperial cybersecurity that challenges the assumption of technological superiority. In modern warfare, technological resilience is often as crucial as firepower. The ability to protect critical systems from infiltration, maintain secure communications, and rapidly adapt to emerging threats can make the difference between victory and defeat. The Galactic Empire, with its vast resources and advanced technology, should have held an insurmountable advantage in this domain. However, our analysis of available data paints a different picture. Imperial technological infrastructure was highly centralized, creating significant cybersecurity vulnerabilities. This centralization, while efficient for top-down control, left the Empire exposed to potentially catastrophic breaches. A single successful intrusion could potentially compromise entire networks, giving rebel forces access to sensitive information or even control over critical systems. Our analysis of recorded rebel cyber attacks reveals a concerning trend. Over the course of the Galactic Civil War, rebel hackers successfully breached Imperial networks with increasing frequency. In the early years of the conflict, such intrusions were rare, occurring perhaps once or twice a year. However, as the war progressed, the frequency of successful attacks increased exponentially. By the time of the Battle of Endor, rebel forces were successfully infiltrating Imperial systems on average once every 2 weeks. The impact of these breaches was substantial. In one notable instance, rebel hackers gained access to Imperial shipping manifests, allowing them to intercept critical supply convoys and significantly disrupt Imperial logistics. Another breach resulted in the temporary disabling of planetary shield generators, creating a window of opportunity for a rebel assault. Perhaps most concerning is the Empire's mean time to detect and respond to security breaches. Our data shows that, on average, it took Imperial cybersecurity teams 72 hours to detect an intrusion and an additional 48 hours to fully contain and neutralize the threat. This low response time gave rebel forces ample opportunity to extract valuable data or cause significant damage before being discovered. The root cause of these vulnerabilities can be traced back to the Empire's reliance on centralized computer systems. While this design allowed for efficient information flow and rapid deployment of updates, it also created a single point of failure that could be exploited. Rebel hackers, once they gained access to a local system, could often leverage that foothold to penetrate deeper into the Imperial network. Furthermore, Imperial computer systems were prone to infiltration due to this centralized network design, which allowed for potentially devastating electronic warfare tactics. The rebels frequently exploited this weakness, using sophisticated jamming techniques to disrupt Imperial communications or introducing false data to confuse enemy forces. Our investigation into the Empire's ability to counter these electronic warfare tactics revealed significant shortcomings. Imperial systems lacked robust cybersecurity protocols, with critical systems often having exposed vulnerabilities. This made it challenging for Imperial forces to maintain secure communications or protect sensitive data in the face of determined rebel attacks. Interestingly, our data shows that the Empire rarely utilized droids for critical technological defense tasks, despite droids having superior reaction times and communication capabilities. This oversight left Imperial networks vulnerable to rapid, automated attacks that could have been more effectively countered by AI-driven defense systems. Another factor contributing to the Empire's technological vulnerabilities was the frequent inclusion of unnecessary physical viewports and exposed infrastructure in their designs. While aesthetically impressive, these features created potential security and structural weaknesses that could be exploited by both physical and cyber attacks. The Empire's technological infrastructure was designed with a rigid, top-down, centralized approach that made it inflexible and slow to adapt to emerging threats. This inflexibility was particularly problematic in the face of the Rebel Alliance's constantly evolving tactics and technologies. While the Empire struggled to update its security protocols, Rebel hackers were continuously developing new methods of infiltration and attack. Perhaps the most significant technological vulnerability lay in the Empire's over-reliance on massive, complex systems like the Death Star. These mega-projects not only diverted resources from more practical defense initiatives, but also created significant cybersecurity risks and potential systemic points of failure. The sheer complexity of these systems made them difficult to fully secure, and their centralized nature meant that a successful attack could have catastrophic consequences. While the Empire's technological vulnerabilities were significant, an even more insidious weakness was lurking within its ranks. The very system designed to create the galaxy's most formidable fighting force was actually setting it up for failure. The Empire's approach to recruitment, training, and retention of personnel reveals a critical flaw in its human resources strategy that would ultimately contribute to its downfall. At first glance, the Imperial military recruitment system appeared to be a well-oiled machine. It was designed to identify and channel the most capable and talented humans into military academies across the galaxy. Getting into an Imperial military academy was considered a prestigious opportunity, offering the best employment prospects for approximately 99% of the galaxy's population. This created a powerful incentive for ambitious individuals to pursue careers within the Imperial military structure. However, our data analysis reveals that this recruitment strategy had unintended consequences. The Empire's aggressive approach to talent acquisition led to a significant brain drain in other professions and industries. As talented individuals were systematically channeled into military roles, other sectors of the Imperial economy and society suffered from a lack of skilled workers and innovators. This imbalance likely contributed to the stagnation of technological and economic progress in non-military fields, weakening the Empire's overall stability and resilience. Moreover, our analysis of Imperial personnel records shows a troubling trend in the recruitment and promotion process over time. In the early years of the Empire, job qualifications and merit played a significant role in determining an individual's career trajectory. However, as the years progressed, we observed a shift towards a system where positions were increasingly attained through status, family connections, and wealth rather than actual competence or skill. This erosion of meritocracy had far-reaching consequences. Our data indicates that the Empire's officer retention rates began to decline as talented individuals found themselves passed over for promotions in favor of well-connected but less capable peers. This not only led to a brain drain within the Imperial military itself, but also created an environment of intense competition and backstabbing among officers. Our analysis of internal communications and performance reviews reveals that Imperial officers were constantly seeking to present something substantial to the Emperor to gain favor. This culture of one-upmanship and political maneuvering diverted focus from actual military strategy and operational efficiency. Instead of fostering teamwork and cooperation, the Imperial promotion system encouraged infighting and undermined unit cohesion. The Empire's recruitment challenges were further exacerbated by the discontinuation of the Camino Clone Trooper program after the Clone Wars. This decision created a significant vacuum in military recruitment that needed to be filled quickly. In response, the Empire established a galaxy-wide military recruitment system that posed as an educational system designed to identify and recruit potential military talent from a young age. While this approach ensured a steady stream of recruits, our data suggests that it also led to a homogenization of the Imperial military. By recruiting primarily from a single demographic, young human males from core and inner rim worlds, the Empire limited its access to diverse perspectives and skills that could have proven valuable in adapting to the varied challenges posed by the Rebel Alliance. Our analysis of Imperial training programs reveals another critical flaw in the Empire's human resources strategy. The Empire invested heavily in training its recruits, with costs per individual estimated to be in the tens of thousands of credits. However, the return on this investment was questionable at best. High casualty rates among Stormtroopers and TIE fighter pilots meant that many expensively trained personnel were lost before they could make a significant contribution to the Imperial cause. Furthermore, our examination of Imperial training curricula shows a focus on conformity and obedience rather than critical thinking and adaptability. This approach produced soldiers who were excellent at following orders but struggled to improvise or adapt to unexpected situations, a significant disadvantage when facing the guerrilla tactics employed by the Rebel Alliance. The Empire's strategies for maintaining troop morale also proved to be ineffective. Our analysis of internal surveys and psychological evaluations reveals widespread dissatisfaction and low morale among Imperial troops, particularly those stationed in remote outposts or engaged in prolonged conflicts. The Empire's reliance on fear and intimidation as motivational tools appears to have backfired, leading to increased rates of desertion and defection as the conflict with the Rebel Alliance intensified. The Empire's iron grip on its subjects went far beyond military might and economic control. Our data analysis reveals a complex web of ideological manipulation that permeated every aspect of citizens' lives. But how effective was this grand strategy of oppression in maintaining loyalty across the vast expanse of Imperial space? To answer this question, we need to look beyond the surface-level propaganda and examine the true impact of Imperial policies on its diverse populations. Our team analyzed extensive datasets from various Imperial sectors, including opinion polls, economic indicators, and records of civil unrest. The results paint a fascinating picture of the Empire's struggle to maintain ideological control. One of the most striking findings from our analysis is the systematic erosion of individual freedoms under Imperial rule. Citizens across the galaxy found themselves stripped of basic rights, including the ability to move freely between systems, securely own property, or even avoid conscription into military service. This widespread suppression of personal liberty created a pervasive atmosphere of fear and resentment that undermined the Empire's efforts to build genuine loyalty. The Empire's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to counteract these negative sentiments. Their strategy relied heavily on creating a sense of fear while simultaneously demonstrating overwhelming military might. One particularly effective tactic involved positioning massive star destroyers to hover ominously over populated planets, serving as a constant reminder of Imperial power. This approach aimed to intimidate populations in compliance, but our data suggests it may have had unintended consequences. When we examined the correlation between economic factors and support for the Empire, we uncovered some surprising trends. Systems that experienced the most direct economic manipulation, including restricted trade and heavy taxation, showed significantly lower levels of Imperial support. In fact, our analysis revealed that in sectors where basic necessities became difficult to afford due to imperial policies, approval ratings for the regime plummeted by an average of 37%. The empire's use of forced labor in critical resource extraction projects further exacerbated this trend. For instance, the conscription of workers to mine kyber crystals for Death Star construction not only demonstrated a complete disregard for individual human rights, but also led to a 52% increase in anti-imperial sentiment in affected systems. This stark disregard for the well-being of its citizens created a growing undercurrent of resistance that the empire struggled to suppress. Our team also investigated the effectiveness of imperial propaganda campaigns across different demographics. Interestingly, we found that the empire's narrative of being a defender of justice and peace resonated more strongly in core worlds, where citizens were more insulated from the harsh realities of imperial rule. However, this message fell flat in outer rim territories, where approval ratings were on average 63% lower than in the galactic core. The Empire's speciesist policies proved to be another significant factor in eroding loyalty. Our data shows that non-human species were disproportionately affected by oppressive measures, leading to a marked decrease in support among these populations. In systems with high non-human populations, imperial approval ratings were consistently 40 to 60% lower than in predominantly human worlds. Perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of our analysis was the insight it provided into the fundamental instability of imperial governance. The Sith philosophy that underpinned the Empire's power structure, with its emphasis on constant internal competition and betrayal, created an environment that was inherently unstable. This ideological approach prioritized individual ambition and power struggles over collective goals, undermining long-term cohesion within the imperial ranks. As we delved deeper into the data, we uncovered a fascinating paradox at the heart of the Empire's ideological strategy. While the regime relied heavily on raw military power to maintain control, our analysis shows that totalitarian systems like the Empire require more than just force to ensure obedience. They need a compelling narrative that justifies their rule and invites citizens to be part of a great future. However, the Empire's actions consistently undermined its own propaganda. The stark contrast between the promised vision of peace and justice and the reality of oppression and exploitation created a cognitive dissonance that became increasingly difficult for citizens to reconcile. Our sentiment analysis of intercepted communications shows a steady decline in belief in imperial ideology, with a 73% increase in expressions of doubt and disillusionment over the course of the Galactic Civil War. As the Empire's grip on its subjects began to falter, its intelligence apparatus faced an even greater challenge. How could a regime with such vast resources consistently fail to anticipate rebel movements? Our analysis uncovers shocking statistics that call into question the very competence of imperial intelligence, revealing critical blind spots that left the regime vulnerable to insurgent activities. Effective intelligence gathering is the backbone of any successful military operation. It provides crucial insights into enemy movements, capabilities, and intentions, allowing for strategic decision-making and proactive responses. For an organization as sprawling as the Galactic Empire, maintaining a robust intelligence network should have been paramount. However, our investigation exposes a surprising disconnect between the Empire's information-gathering capabilities and its ability to act on that intelligence effectively. The Empire's intelligence structure was complex and fragmented, with multiple organizations vying for supremacy. Imperial Intelligence, also known as AURAT, and the Imperial Security Bureau, ISB, were the primary agencies responsible for gathering and analyzing information. However, rather than working in harmony, these organizations were locked in a constant power struggle, competing for resources and influence within the imperial hierarchy. This internal conflict severely hampered the Empire's ability to present a unified intelligence front against the growing rebel threat. Our data analysis reveals a startling trend in the Empire's ability to predict and counter rebel operations. Using advanced predictive modeling techniques, we estimated that Imperial intelligence failed to anticipate approximately 68% of significant rebel movements and attacks. This staggering figure becomes even more concerning when we consider the Empire's vast surveillance network and technological superiority. The Empire's intelligence gathering was particularly ineffective in the Outer Rim territories, where rebel activity was most prevalent. Our spatial analysis shows that Imperial predictions of rebel movements in these regions were only marginally better than random chance, with a success rate of just 54%. This glaring weakness allowed rebel cells to operate with relative impunity in areas far from the Empire's center of power. To quantify the Empire's responsiveness to rebel threats, we calculated the mean time between the initiation of a rebel operation and the Empire's first countermeasure. The results are sobering. On average, it took Imperial forces 37 standard hours to mount any form of response to a rebel attack. This delay provided ample time for rebel forces to complete their objectives and disappear back into hiding, further eroding the Empire's ability to maintain control. The accuracy of Imperial threat assessments also came under scrutiny in our analysis. By comparing Imperial intelligence reports with actual rebel capabilities and intentions gathered from declassified rebel archives, we found that the Empire consistently overestimated the strength of large-scale rebel operations while underestimating the threat posed by smaller, more nimble insurgent cells. This misallocation of resources often left the Empire vulnerable to guerrilla tactics and asymmetric warfare. Perhaps most damning was the Empire's inability to effectively infiltrate rebel networks. Despite its enormous resources, Imperial intelligence agencies struggled to place operatives within the Alliance's ranks. Our analysis of known Imperial infiltration attempts shows a success rate of less than 12%. With the vast majority of these infiltrators being discovered and neutralized before they could provide any actionable intelligence. The ISB in particular became increasingly powerful as the Empire struggled to combat the growing rebel threat. Our data shows that by the later stages of the Galactic Civil War, the ISB had been granted authority to override conventional military units in 73% of encounters with suspected rebel activity. While this centralization of power was intended to streamline decision-making, it often led to heavy-handed tactics that further alienated local populations and drove more citizens into the arms of the rebellion. Interestingly, our analysis uncovered evidence of a more analytical approach to intelligence gathering within the Imperial ranks, as exemplified by characters like Dedra Miro. However, these data-driven methodologies were often dismissed or overlooked by the Empire's upper echelons, who favored more traditional and aggressive tactics. Our sentiment analysis of internal Imperial communications shows that proposals for more nuanced intelligence strategies were rejected 82% of the time in favor of brute force approaches. This preference for force over finesse extended to the Empire's handling of captured rebels. Rather than focusing on extracting valuable intelligence through sophisticated interrogation techniques, Imperial agencies prioritized punishment and vengeance. Our analysis of Imperial prisoner records indicates that only 8% of captured rebels provided any actionable intelligence, with the majority of these instances occurring early in their captivity before more brutal methods were employed. The Empire's failures extended far beyond its military and intelligence shortcomings. At the heart of its downfall lay a deeply flawed decision-making process, corrupted by fear, ambition, and a ruthless ideology. Our data analysis reveals a shocking pattern in how the Empire's top brass approached critical choices, with Emperor Palpatine's leadership style casting a long shadow over the entire organization. Evidence-based decision-making is a cornerstone of effective governance, relying on data and objective analysis to guide policy and strategy. However, our investigation into Imperial records shows a stark departure from this approach. Instead, we found a decision-making environment dominated by personal agendas, fear-based tactics, and a culture of constant internal competition. Our team analyzed thousands of Imperial strategy meetings, policy decisions, and battlefield reports to assess the effectiveness of the Empire's leadership. The results paint a troubling picture of an organization where data-driven recommendations were frequently disregarded in favor of impulsive, emotionally charged choices. One of the most striking findings was the frequency with which Emperor Palpatine overrode evidence-based recommendations. Our analysis shows that in 78% of documented cases where data-driven proposals conflicted with Palpatine's personal views, the Emperor chose to ignore the empirical evidence. This pattern of disregarding expert advice and objective data had far-reaching consequences for the Empire's strategic planning and operational effectiveness. The impact of this leadership style trickled down through the entire Imperial hierarchy. We found that high-ranking officers, emulating Palpatine's approach, increasingly relied on intuition and personal ambition rather than sound analysis when making critical decisions. This created a toxic environment where advancement often depended more on an individual's ability to curry favor with superiors than on their actual competence or strategic acumen. Our team developed a comprehensive model to calculate the success rate of decisions made by various Imperial leaders. We factored in variables such as the complexity of the situation, available intelligence, and the long-term consequences of each choice. The results were stark. Decisions made purely based on data and expert recommendations had a 72% success rate, while those made by overriding such advice succeeded only 31% of the time. This discrepancy becomes even more alarming when we consider the Empire's approach to risk assessment and management. Our analysis of Imperial contingency plans and crisis response protocols revealed a consistent underestimation of potential threats and an overconfidence in the Empire's ability to crush any opposition through sheer force. Perhaps most damaging was the influence of Sith ideology on Imperial decision-making processes. Palpatine's belief in ruling through fear and strength permeated every level of the organization. As one Imperial source put it, Palpatine viewed leaders who couldn't utilize these tools as fools. This philosophy created a leadership culture where compromise and diplomacy were seen as weaknesses, and brute force was often the default solution to complex problems. The consequences of this approach were far-reaching. Our data shows that the Imperial hierarchy became what one analyst described as a pool of sharks, where officers were motivated solely by ambition and insatiable greed. This environment of constant scheming and backstabbing had a devastating effect on the Empire's ability to respond effectively to external threats. We found numerous instances where genuinely talented and competent individuals were sidelined or replaced by incompetent commanders who prioritized individual glory over organizational goals. This brain drain significantly impacted the Empire's strategic capabilities, with our models estimating a 43% reduction in overall military effectiveness due to this misallocation of human resources. The situation was further exacerbated by a promotion system that increasingly favored status, family connections, and wealth over actual qualifications. Our analysis of Imperial personnel records shows that by the later years of the Empire, individuals from well-connected families were 3.7 times more likely to receive promotions than their equally qualified peers from less influential backgrounds. Perhaps the most critical flaw in the Empire's leadership structure was Palpatine's implementation of Sith teachings of constant internal competition directly into the organization's fabric. This created an inherently unstable system where Imperial officers were more focused on undermining each other than addressing external threats like the Rebel Alliance. Our data shows that in the year leading up to the Battle of Yavin, Imperial officers spent an average of 37% of their time engaged in internal politicking and jockeying for position, compared to just 18% on actual strategic planning against the rebellion. This misallocation of time and resources proved catastrophic as the rebel threat continued to grow. While the Empire's massive size should have given it an overwhelming advantage, our data reveals a puzzling trend. The larger the Imperial force, the slower it responded to rebel innovations. This counterintuitive relationship between scale and adaptability exposes a critical flaw in the Empire's military doctrine and organizational structure. At its core, the Empire's approach to warfare and governance was rooted in the Tarkin doctrine, which emphasized rule through fear and overwhelming force. This philosophy permeated every level of Imperial strategy, from starship design to tactical planning. However, our analysis shows that this rigid adherence to intimidation as a primary tactic severely hampered the Empire's ability to adapt to the evolving nature of the galactic civil war. One of the most striking examples of this inflexibility can be seen in the Empire's starship designs. Imperial star destroyers, while imposing and powerful, were primarily designed for psychological intimidation rather than versatile military engagement. This focus on fear over function left these massive vessels vulnerable to asymmetric warfare tactics employed by the more adaptable rebel forces. The Empire's procurement and design process for new military technology was also plagued by extreme inefficiency. Our data indicates that it took years for the Imperial military to develop and deploy new starfighters capable of effectively countering rebel tactics. This sluggish pace of innovation stands in stark contrast to the Rebel Alliance's ability to rapidly iterate and improve their own technology and tactics. Perhaps even more damaging was the Empire's over-reliance on resource-intensive military assets like star destroyers and the Death Star. These massive projects not only drained valuable resources, but also prevented quick pivots in military strategy. The sheer scale of these undertakings meant that once committed, the Empire was locked into a particular course of action, unable to rapidly adjust to changing battlefield conditions or emerging threats. Our analysis of Imperial battlefield performance reveals a consistent pattern of slow response times to new rebel tactics. On average, it took Imperial forces 2.7 times longer to develop and implement effective countermeasures compared to the Rebel Alliance's ability to introduce new strategies. This adaptability gap widened as the conflict progressed, with the Empire's response time increasing by an average of 18% each standard year of the war. The impact of the Empire's notorious bureaucracy on its adaptability cannot be overstated. Our data indicates that the average time required for a tactical innovation proposed by frontline commanders to be approved and implemented was 237 standard days. In contrast, rebel forces were able to disseminate and adopt new tactics across their organization in an average of just 14 standard days. This bureaucratic inertia was further compounded by the Empire's rigid chain of command and the culture of fear that permeated its ranks. Our analysis of internal communications reveals that lower-ranking officers were often hesitant to propose new ideas or report failures, fearing reprisal from their superiors. This created a dangerous echo chamber at the highest levels of Imperial leadership, further insulating them from the realities of the conflict. The rare exceptions to this pattern of inflexibility only serve to highlight the systemic nature of the problem. Grand Admiral Thrawn, for instance, represented a notable example of strategic thinking within the Imperial military. However, our data shows that even his innovative approaches were frequently stymied by the broader organizational rigidity of the Empire. In 68% of cases where Thrawn proposed unconventional tactics, they were either rejected outright or so watered down by the time they were implemented that they lost much of their efficacy. While the Empire focused on building superweapons, a silent threat was growing beneath the surface. How long could the galaxy sustain the Empire's voracious appetite for resources? Our analysis reveals a startling countdown to collapse that even the most astute Imperial strategists failed to recognize. At its core, the concept of sustainable resource management involves balancing the extraction and use of resources with their natural replenishment rates. This principle ensures long-term availability and minimizes environmental impact. However, our data suggests that the Galactic Empire's approach to resource management was fundamentally at odds with these sustainable practices. The Empire's military-industrial complex consumed vast quantities of resources across the galaxy at an alarming rate. This massive consumption was primarily driven by the construction and maintenance of an enormous fleet, including resource-intensive capital ships like the Imperial-class star destroyers. These behemoths required enormous quantities of raw materials and energy, both in their initial construction and ongoing operation. Our analysis of Imperial resource extraction practices reveals a disturbing pattern. The Empire frequently resorted to forceful seizure of resources, with little regard for local populations or long-term sustainability. One particularly egregious example is the Empire's exploitation of kyber crystal mines. Workers were often conscripted and forced to extract these rare crystals, which were crucial for projects like the Death Star. This approach not only depleted the limited supply of kyber crystals, but also created significant social unrest in the affected regions. The Empire's resource management strategy heavily favored outer rim and less developed worlds for extraction. These planets, often lacking the political clout or military strength to resist, bore the brunt of Imperial resource hunger. The Empire's practices showed little consideration for sustainable extraction methods or the welfare of local ecosystems. This short-sighted approach led to rapid depletion of resources and widespread environmental degradation on many worlds. Further compounding the issue was the Empire's tendency to nationalize entire planetary industries and resource extraction operations. While this gave the Empire direct control over valuable resources, it also had the effect of destabilizing local economic ecosystems. Many planets that had previously managed their resources sustainably found themselves subject to accelerated extraction rates that far exceeded natural replenishment. Our data indicates that the Empire's resource depletion was so severe that it had long-lasting consequences beyond its fall. By the time of the First Order's rise, many worlds were reduced to scavenging from fallen Imperial ships and infrastructure. This paints a stark picture of the level of resource exhaustion that occurred under Imperial rule. Perhaps the most glaring example of the Empire's resource mismanagement is embodied in the Death Star projects. These massive undertakings represented an extreme misallocation of resources on an unprecedented scale. Our calculations suggest that a single Death Star could consume resources equivalent to 0.21% of the entire galactic GDP per year during its construction period. To put this into perspective, this is akin to a modern nation on Earth, dedicating a significant portion of its annual economic output to a single military project for years on end. The opportunity cost of such massive resource allocation cannot be overstated. The materials, energy, and labor diverted to Death Star construction could have been used to address critical infrastructure needs, develop sustainable energy solutions, or invest in technologies to improve resource extraction efficiency. Instead, these resources were quite literally obliterated, along with the Death Stars themselves. Our analysis of Imperial energy production and consumption rates reveals an equally troubling picture. The Empire's focus on rapid industrialization and military expansion led to an exponential increase in energy demand. However, investments in energy production infrastructure failed to keep pace. This resulted in an ever-widening gap between energy supply and demand, putting immense strain on existing resources. We've calculated the depletion rate of key Imperial-controlled resources and the results are alarming. Critical materials such as durasteel, transparasteel, and various rare earth elements were being consumed at rates up to 300% faster than their natural replenishment or synthetic production could match. This unsustainable extraction was rapidly depleting finite reserves across the galaxy. The environmental impact of imperial industrial practices was equally devastating. Our data shows widespread pollution of air, water, and soil on planets subjected to intensive imperial resource extraction. Entire ecosystems were disrupted or destroyed, leading to cascading effects on planetary climates and biodiversity. The long-term consequences of this environmental degradation would likely have taken centuries to reverse, even with focused restoration efforts. Perhaps most telling is our investigation into the Empire's investment in renewable energy sources. Despite possessing the technological capability to harness sustainable energy on a massive scale, Imperial records show minimal allocation of resources towards such initiatives. Less than 2% of the Empire's energy research budget was dedicated to developing renewable energy technologies, a shockingly low figure given the vast energy needs of a galactic civilization. The Empire's grip on galactic resources seemed unshakable, but our investigation uncovers a different story when it comes to fiscal policy. How did a government with near limitless power manage to create an economic house of cards that threatened to topple the entire system? To understand the Empire's economic failures, we need to examine the foundation of its financial system. The Intergalactic Banking Clan, IGBC, played a crucial role in the galaxy's monetary structure during the Imperial era. Unlike most governments that back their own currency, the IGBC was a privately owned institution that effectively guaranteed the Republic's money supply. This unusual arrangement set the stage for future instability. During the Clone Wars, a pivotal moment occurred when the IGBC was deregulated. This move allowed for more flexible financial practices, but it also opened the door to potentially riskier strategies. As Palpatine rose to power, he made a calculated move to seize control of the IGBC's central vaults. This action effectively nationalized the banking system while maintaining a facade of independent operation. The implications of this takeover were far-reaching. By controlling both the government and the financial institutions, Palpatine created a system where economic policy could be manipulated to serve his political agenda. This consolidation of power laid the groundwork for the Empire's future economic mismanagement. As we analyze the data, a clear pattern emerges of the Empire's economic strategy. Palpatine's approach involved targeting key industrial worlds such as Corellia, Quat, Fondor, and Ringo Vinda. These planets were crucial for supporting the rapid militarization that became a hallmark of imperial rule. By seizing control of these industrial centers, the Empire could dictate production priorities and resource allocation. The nationalization of weapon and shipbuilding manufacturers further concentrated economic power in the hands of the imperial government. These companies were forced to prioritize military production at the expense of civilian economic development. This shift had profound consequences for local economies across the galaxy. One of the most troubling aspects of imperial economic policy was the widespread use of slave labor and conscripted workers, particularly in resource extraction industries. This practice allowed the Empire to reduce production costs, but it came at a terrible human cost and further destabilized local economies. The Empire's economic system was characterized by extreme centralized control. The government dictated production quotas, trade regulations, and resource allocation across the galaxy. While this level of control might seem efficient on the surface, it actually created significant inefficiencies and stifled innovation. As we examine the data on imperial economic performance, a stark contrast emerges between official reports and the reality faced by citizens across the galaxy. The Empire's need to continuously invent enemies to justify its massive military expenditures created a crisis of legitimacy. Citizens began to question the necessity of such enormous spending, especially as they witnessed the deterioration of their local economies. The impact of these policies on employment levels was severe. Widespread unemployment became a significant issue, particularly in sectors that weren't directly tied to military production. This economic hardship fueled growing resentment and ultimately contributed to the rise of rebellion and resistance movements. Our analysis reveals that the Imperial credit, once considered the stable backbone of galactic trade, was facing unprecedented inflation in the Empire's final years. The exact inflation rate remains difficult to pin down due to the Empire's practice of manipulating economic data, but estimates suggest it had reached alarming levels that would indeed make even the most ruthless Hutt loan shark blush. The concentration of wealth in the core worlds, coupled with the neglect of outer rim economies, created a dangerous imbalance. This disparity not only fueled social unrest, but also undermined the overall stability of the galactic economy. The Empire's failure to address these economic disparities between sectors proved to be a critical mistake. When faced with economic crises, the Empire's response was typically to double down on its existing policies. Rather than adapting to changing economic conditions, Imperial leadership often resorted to increased military spending and tighter controls. This inflexibility prevented the development of effective solutions to mounting economic challenges. As we piece together the data, it becomes clear that the Imperial economy was far more fragile than it appeared on the surface. The banking system was teetering on the edge of potential bankruptcy, and the threat of massive economic disruption loomed large. Research conducted in the aftermath of the Battle of Endor suggested that the collapse of the Imperial regime could lead to the disappearance of the banking sector altogether. As the Imperial economy teetered on the brink of collapse, citizens across the galaxy were reaching their breaking point. What if the real threat to the Empire's power wasn't external, but brewing within its own oppressed populations? Our analysis reveals a surprising correlation between Imperial military presence and the frequency of protests that challenges conventional wisdom about social control. While the Empire believed that a strong military presence would deter unrest, the data tells a different story. In systems with high Imperial military concentrations, we observed a 63% increase in protest activities compared to those with minimal Imperial presence. This counterintuitive finding suggests that the Empire's show of force actually galvanized resistance rather than suppressing it. The frequency of anti-Imperial demonstrations followed a clear pattern. In the early years of Imperial rule, protests were relatively infrequent, occurring perhaps once or twice a year in major systems. However, as the Empire's grip tightened, so did the resolve of its citizens. By the time of the Battle of Yavin, we recorded an average of one significant protest every 2 standard weeks in systems under direct Imperial control. The Empire's response to these demonstrations was as brutal as it was ineffective. Our data shows that Imperial forces took an average of 18 standard hours to mobilize a response to a protest, often resorting to extreme measures such as mass arrests, property destruction, and even lethal force. These heavy-handed tactics, while temporarily quelling individual demonstrations, served to fuel long-term resentment and resistance. The impact of Imperial policies on various species and cultures was particularly stark. Non-human populations bore the brunt of Imperial oppression, with data indicating that these communities experienced a 40% higher rate of arbitrary arrests and a 55% higher rate of property seizures compared to human-dominated worlds. One of the most damning pieces of evidence against the Empire's social policies comes from the mining worlds. In systems where the Empire implemented forced labor practices for resource extraction, Particularly in Kyber crystal mines, we observed a staggering 52% increase in anti-imperial sentiment. This surge in dissatisfaction directly correlated with a 37% rise in rebel recruitment in these areas. The Empire's social policies, rooted in Sith philosophy, created a system that valued conflict and personal advancement over collective stability. This approach manifested in a governance structure that pitted citizens against each other, fostering an environment of mistrust and betrayal. Our analysis of intercepted communications revealed a 73% increase in expressions of doubt and disillusionment during the Galactic Civil War period. Perhaps most telling is the data on the Empire's intelligence failures. Imperial predictions of rebel movements in the Outer Rim territories had a success rate of just 54%, indicating a fundamental disconnect between the regime and the populace it claimed to control. This inability to accurately gauge the sentiments and actions of its citizens proved to be a critical weakness. The Empire's rigid social control mechanisms were so inflexible that they failed to adapt to changing circumstances, particularly the growing rebel insurgency. Our data shows that Imperial forces took an average of 37 standard hours to mount any form of response to a rebel attack, a delay that proved fatal in many instances. Interestingly, our analysis revealed that in sectors where basic necessities became difficult to afford, approval ratings for the Empire plummeted by an average of 37%. This economic factor played a significant role in fueling social unrest, creating a vicious cycle of oppression and resistance. The Empire's reliance on fear as a tool of control ultimately proved to be its undoing. While fear initially suppressed open dissent, it also created a pressure cooker of resentment that eventually exploded into full-scale rebellion. Our data shows that for every act of imperial oppression, rebel recruitment saw a corresponding spike of 15-20% in the affected region. As systems turned against the Empire in droves, a pattern emerged that went beyond mere military tactics or economic pressures. Our analysis uncovers a diplomatic disaster so severe, it calls into question everything we thought we knew about imperial strategy. The data reveals a shocking trend in galactic diplomacy that even the Emperor couldn't foresee, one that would ultimately contribute to the downfall of his regime. Diplomacy has long been considered the lifeblood of any successful empire, allowing for the peaceful resolution of conflicts and the cultivation of mutually beneficial relationships. However, the Galactic Empire's approach to interstellar relations deviated significantly from this conventional wisdom. Our research indicates that imperial diplomatic efforts were fundamentally flawed, prioritizing fear and intimidation over genuine alliance building. This counterproductive strategy manifested in various ways across the galaxy. Imperial diplomats frequently resorted to threats or forcible control of planetary systems, creating widespread resentment instead of fostering cooperation. The use of military force as a primary diplomatic tool became increasingly common, alienating potential allies and neutral systems that might have otherwise been amenable to imperial rule. To quantify the impact of these misguided policies, we analyzed data on system allegiances throughout the imperial era. The results were staggering. A significant number of star systems actively sought to switch their allegiance from the Empire to the rebellion. This mass exodus of support wasn't limited to fringe worlds or those with pre-existing anti-imperial sentiment. Even core worlds that initially benefited from imperial rule began to turn against the government as the true nature of its diplomatic approach became apparent. One factor that severely undermined the Empire's diplomatic credibility was its blatant speciesist policies. The data shows a clear pattern of discrimination against non-human populations, which not only violated principles of galactic equality, but also alienated a vast portion of potential allies. This short-sighted approach effectively cut off the Empire from the diverse perspectives and resources that a truly inclusive government could have harnessed. Perhaps one of the most damaging diplomatic blunders was Emperor Palpatine's decision to dissolve the Imperial Senate. This move eliminated a critical platform for diplomatic negotiation, further isolating the empire from the very systems it sought to control. Without this forum for dialogue and compromise, many worlds felt they had no choice but to seek alternative alliances, often with the growing rebel movement. Our analysis also revealed that the empire's approach to diplomacy was fundamentally extractive, focusing on resource exploitation rather than mutual cooperation. This strategy may have yielded short-term gains in terms of raw materials and strategic assets, but it came at the cost of long-term stability and goodwill. Systems that might have been willing partners in a more equitable arrangement instead found themselves treated as little more than resource deposits to be mined for the empire's benefit. To better understand the rate at which the empire lost diplomatic allies, we examined treaty compliance records and diplomatic communiques from across the galaxy. The data paints a grim picture of rapidly deteriorating relationships. On average, for every standard year of imperial rule, the empire lost the support of 3 to 5% of its allied systems. This steady erosion of diplomatic ties created a snowball effect, with each defection making it harder for the empire to maintain its grip on remaining worlds. The empire's handling of interspecies conflicts further exacerbated its diplomatic woes. Rather than serving as an impartial mediator, imperial forces often intervened in ways that favored human-dominated worlds or furthered imperial interests, regardless of the merits of each side's arguments. This biased approach not only failed to resolve conflicts, but often intensified them, leading to increased instability and resentment towards imperial rule. Perhaps most damaging was the impact of imperial aggression on neutral systems. Our data shows that for every act of unprovoked imperial military action against a neutral world, an average of 2 to 3 neighboring systems would shift their stance from neutral to pro-rebel. This ripple effect of hostility significantly expanded the rebellion's sphere of influence, often at a faster rate than imperial forces could counter through traditional military means. As we delved deeper into the diplomatic effectiveness of the empire, a clear picture emerged of a regime that had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of soft power in galactic politics. While the empire's military might was formidable, its inability to cultivate genuine alliances and goodwill among its subject worlds created a fragile foundation that could not withstand the pressures of rebellion. The empire's control over information was a cornerstone of its power, but our data analysis reveals a surprising vulnerability in this strategy. While the imperial propaganda machine was vast and pervasive, its effectiveness waned as the conflict with the rebellion intensified. Our research shows that the empire's information control strategy was rooted in a need to constantly assert a state-approved truth. This approach utilized methods like mass media broadcasts and extensive censorship to shape public perception. However, the data suggests that this heavy-handed approach may have backfired, creating a thirst for alternative information sources among the populace. One of the key tools in the empire's arsenal was the chain code system, a universal identification and tracking mechanism that allowed comprehensive monitoring of citizens' movements and activities. This system provided the empire with an unprecedented level of surveillance capability, theoretically enabling them to quickly identify and suppress any signs of dissent. The Imperial Security Bureau, ISB, played a critical role in this information control strategy. Our analysis shows that as the conflict with the rebellion escalated, the ISB increasingly took over conventional military units to combat insurgent threats. This shift in focus from intelligence gathering to direct intervention suggests a growing desperation to maintain control over the narrative. However, despite these extensive efforts, our data indicates that the empire's grip on information was slipping. We found a steady increase in the number of citizens accessing non-imperial news sources over time. In the early years of the Empire, only about 5% of the population had regular access to alternative information. By the time of the Battle of Yavin, this number had grown to nearly 20%, and it continued to rise sharply in the following years. This trend correlates strongly with an increase in rebel sympathy. Our analysis shows that for every 10% increase in access to non-imperial information sources, there was a corresponding 15% rise in pro-rebel sentiment. This suggests that exposure to alternative viewpoints was a significant factor in eroding support for the Empire. The Empire's response to this trend was to double down on its censorship and surveillance efforts. Our data shows a 300% increase in resources allocated to information control in the 5 years leading up to the Battle of Endor. However, this increase in effort did not translate to improved results. In fact, we observed an inverse relationship between the intensity of censorship efforts and their effectiveness. One of the most interesting findings from our analysis is the role of fear in the Empire's information strategy. The data suggests that the Empire believed that crushing hope was more important than providing accurate information. This approach led to increasingly draconian measures, such as criminalizing dissent and maintaining a network of informers to report suspicious activities. However, our analysis of underground communication networks reveals that these harsh measures often had the opposite of their intended effect. We found that systems with the strictest information controls also had the most active underground information networks. These networks proved remarkably resilient, with new channels of communication emerging faster than the Empire could shut them down. The Empire's information control strategy also evolved beyond simple physical surveillance, utilizing advanced technological methods to track and control populations. However, our data shows that these high-tech solutions often created new vulnerabilities. For example, we found numerous instances where rebel hackers were able to exploit these centralized systems, gaining access to valuable intelligence and disrupting Imperial operations. Perhaps most tellingly, our analysis of Imperial communications reveals a growing disconnect between the official narrative and the reality on the ground. We found that in the later years of the conflict, there was often a significant delay between major events and their acknowledgement in official Imperial channels. In some cases, the Empire was able to completely block news of significant setbacks, such as Imperial defeats or even the Emperor's death, from reaching certain populations. However, this ability to control the flow of information came at a cost. Our data shows a strong correlation between the level of information control in a system and the speed at which that system ultimately turned against the Empire when the truth became known. Systems that had been kept in the dark were more likely to react with shock and anger when the extent of Imperial deception was revealed. The Empire's vast legions of Stormtroopers, once symbols of Imperial might, consistently underperformed on the battlefield. Our data reveals a surprising truth about quantity versus quality in galactic warfare. While the Empire's strategy of fielding an enormous army seemed formidable on paper, the reality proved far less impressive. At the heart of this paradox lies the Empire's approach to military personnel, which mirrored industrial mass production techniques. The goal was to create interchangeable standardized units with minimal individual variation. This philosophy prioritized visual intimidation and uniformity over actual combat effectiveness, resulting in a force that looked impressive but often faltered when faced with determined opposition. Our analysis of combat data reveals a stark disparity between Stormtrooper numbers and their actual impact on the battlefield. Despite their numerical superiority, Stormtroopers consistently displayed poor hit rates and limited tactical adaptability. This ineffectiveness can be traced back to their training, which emphasized conformity and following orders over tactical creativity or individual initiative. The Empire's recruitment systems were designed to funnel young people into military service, creating a continuous supply of soldiers. However, this focus on quantity came at the expense of quality. Imperial military training prioritized creating soldiers who could be easily replaced, reflecting a philosophy of expendability over individual soldier value. This approach stands in stark contrast to the more specialized clone troopers that preceded them, marking a significant shift in military strategy. To understand the full scope of this issue, we must examine the cost-effectiveness of the Stormtrooper program. While mass-producing standardized armor and weapons might seem economically sound, the reality is more complex. The Empire invested substantial resources in equipping millions of troops, yet the return on this investment in terms of combat effectiveness was questionable at best. Our data indicates that the rapid training programs implemented by the Empire often resulted in soldiers who were underprepared for the realities of combat. While these programs allowed for quick deployment of large numbers of troops, they failed to instill the necessary skills and adaptability required for effective warfare. This became particularly evident when stormtroopers faced the more agile and creative tactics employed by rebel forces. Interestingly, the psychological impact of fielding an army of identical troops yielded mixed results. On one hand, the sight of a vast uniform force could indeed be intimidating to civilian populations and some opposing forces. However, our analysis shows that this effect diminished significantly against determined and ideologically motivated opponents like the Rebel Alliance. In fact, the uniformity of stormtroopers may have worked against them in some instances, making their tactics predictable and easier to counter. The Empire's focus on creating a homogeneous fighting force also had unintended consequences on unit cohesion and morale. While the intent was to foster a sense of unity, the lack of individual identity often resulted in reduced personal investment in mission outcomes. This stands in stark contrast to rebel units, where diverse backgrounds and personal motivations often led to stronger bonds and more creative problem-solving in combat situations. As we delve deeper into the data, a critical flaw in the Stormtrooper program becomes apparent. The Empire's pursuit of an imposing, standardized army led to a force that was inflexible and ill-equipped to handle the diverse challenges presented by a galaxy-wide conflict. The one-size-fits-all approach to training and equipment meant that stormtroopers were often at a disadvantage when facing specialized opponents or operating in varied environments. Our analysis reveals that in engagements where adaptability and individual initiative were key factors, stormtroopers consistently underperformed. The rigid command structure and emphasis on unquestioning obedience often prevented troops from effectively responding to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. This weakness was frequently exploited by rebel forces who emphasized flexibility and individual empowerment in their tactical approach. The data also highlights a concerning trend in the Empire's response to these shortcomings. Rather than addressing the root causes of stormtrooper ineffectiveness, the Empire often doubled down on its strategy of overwhelming force. This led to a cycle of diminishing returns, where increased numbers failed to compensate for fundamental flaws in training and doctrine. While the Empire's technological prowess seemed unassailable, our data reveals a startling vulnerability at the heart of their military power. The very systems designed to ensure Imperial dominance may have been setting the stage for their downfall. Our analysis uncovers a pattern of technological over-reliance with far-reaching consequences for the Empire's ability to maintain control across the galaxy. Imperial starships, despite their imposing appearance, often featured critically exposed weak points. Bridges and sensor arrays were frequently positioned in vulnerable locations, making them easy targets for rebel attacks. This design flaw wasn't limited to a single class of vessel, but was widespread across the Imperial fleet, creating a systemic weakness that the rebellion could exploit repeatedly. Moreover, many Imperial ships lacked basic defensive capabilities that one might expect from an advanced military force. TIE fighters, the backbone of the Empire's starfighter corps, were notoriously under-equipped. These craft lacked shields, hyperdrives, and even life support systems, prioritizing mass production and overwhelming numbers over pilot survivability and combat effectiveness. The Empire's technological infrastructure was highly centralized, a choice that created significant vulnerabilities. Disrupting key systems could potentially cause cascading failures across multiple sectors, effectively crippling Imperial operations over vast regions of space. This centralization made the Empire's technological backbone a tempting target for rebel strikes and cyber attacks. Interestingly, the Empire rarely utilized droids for critical technological functions such as weapon targeting, despite droids having superior reaction times and communication capabilities. This decision to rely on human operators for tasks that could be more efficiently performed by machines points to a deeper issue within Imperial military doctrine, a reluctance to fully leverage available technologies in favor of maintaining human control. The design of Imperial capital ships also revealed a concerning trend. Star destroyers, for instance, were constructed with weapon placements that limited their attack zones, often concentrating firepower on the sides and leaving other angles vulnerable. This created blind spots that skilled rebel pilots could exploit, turning the Empire's massive warships into lumbering targets. Our data suggests that the Empire's technological procurement process was often driven more by political ambition and the desire to instill fear than by strategic military requirements. This led to the development of impressive but impractical weapon systems that failed to provide a significant tactical advantage in actual combat situations. The frequency of critical system failures in Imperial technology is particularly alarming. Our analysis shows that in engagements where the Empire held a clear technological advantage, system malfunctions or design flaws negated this edge in approximately 28% of cases. These failures ranged from weapon systems going offline at crucial moments to shield generators failing under sustained attack. Calculating the Empire's ability to operate without advanced technological support reveals another layer of vulnerability. In simulated scenarios where key systems were disabled, Imperial forces showed a marked decrease in combat effectiveness. On average, the loss of centralized command and control systems reduced operational efficiency by 45%, while the disabling of advanced targeting systems decreased accuracy by 60%. The impact of electromagnetic pulse (EMP) weapons on Imperial military effectiveness cannot be overstated. Our data indicates that the Empire's forces were particularly susceptible to this form of attack. In engagements where rebel forces successfully deployed EMP weapons, Imperial combat capability was reduced by an average of 73%. This susceptibility stems from the Empire's heavy reliance on electronic systems without adequate hardening or redundancies. The vulnerability of centralized Imperial computer systems presented another critical weakness. Rebel hackers were able to exploit these systems with increasing frequency as the conflict progressed. Each successful breach not only provided valuable intelligence to the rebellion, but also sowed chaos within Imperial ranks, disrupting communications and logistics. Our technological vulnerability assessment paints a clear picture of an empire whose greatest strength had become its most critical weakness. The data shows that the empire's critical dependence on vulnerable technology created a fragile military infrastructure. While individual imperial technologies were often superior to their rebel counterparts, the interconnected nature of these systems meant that a single point of failure could have catastrophic consequences. As we've seen throughout our analysis, the empire's downfall wasn't due to a single factor, but rather a complex interplay of economic mismanagement, military inefficiency, and ideological weaknesses. The data points to a critical lack of balance in the empire's approach to governance and strategy. Successful organizations require a holistic approach that balances economic efficiency, strategic vision, and adaptable leadership, rather than relying solely on fear or military might. This insight underscores the importance of comprehensive data analysis in strategic planning. By examining multiple facets of an organization's operations and culture, we can identify systemic issues and potential points of failure. These analytical techniques aren't just applicable to fictional galactic empires. In real-world scenarios, businesses and governments can benefit from this multidimensional approach to data analysis. By considering economic, military, technological, and social factors in tandem, organizations can develop more resilient strategies and avoid the pitfalls that led to the empire's collapse.